This video will focus specifically on human population and some specific things that only affect humans and some unique characteristics of human populations. All right, so initially the human population grew very slowly. We talked about this some at the beginning of the year. When they were hunter-gatherers, it was difficult for families to be very large because you had to drag the kids around with you, and survivorship was pretty poor. Then with the agricultural revolution came a slight increase in population, but you're still talking about a relatively small number of people, so even though the population was increasing, you didn't have a very big starting population. But for the past 200 years, the human population has experienced rapid exponential growth, and that is primarily due to the Industrial Revolution, because with the Industrial Revolution came new technology and the ability to provide food for more people, and medicine was big in increasing survivorship. Of course, you have the little dip there due to the Black Death or the bubonic plague, but beyond that, we've seen a dramatic increase in human population over the last couple hundred years. So unfortunately, I've got a hyperlink on this slide that's not going to work for me recording this through PowerPoint, so I will try to provide that link for you guys separately, and I encourage you to check it out because it's an interesting look at our human population numbers both in the US and worldwide. So in terms of population growth rate worldwide, it has slowed, but we're still kind of dealing with overall rapid growth. It's getting better, but we're not there yet. So this data is a little bit old, but in 2006, developed countries had a growth rate of about 0.1%, and developing countries had a growth rate of about 1.5%. So most of the growth is still happening in the developing countries, and as countries move from being developing to being developed, as we'll see later, that changes, that drops. And the projection is that by 2050, the human population will be somewhere between 7.2 and 10.6 billion people. I believe we're actually already past the 7.2 and quickly headed towards the 8.9. So right now, I'm not sure that we will hit that medium potential growth rate or growth point where we level off, or if we're going to continue towards the high projection. But it's up to people, obviously, to make those changes. All right, so what has to change in order to cause the world population to level off is fertility. Fertility obviously just refers to how many children a woman bears in her lifetime. And the goal for most countries is to reach what's called replacement level fertility, which is the number of children a couple must bear to replace themselves. So in theory, you would think that that means 2, right? That if every couple has 2 children, then we're replacing ourselves. It turns out that that number is a little variable depending on the country you're in. It's always going to be slightly above 2, and I'll explain why in just a second. But developed countries, the replacement level fertility is about 2.1, and in developing countries, it's about 2.5. So the reason why it's not exactly 2 is because, unfortunately, not every child will grow up and reach reproductive age themselves, and so we have to allow for that in our average. So in reality, we have to have slightly more than 2 children in order to ensure that our population remains stable. If we have less than that, then our population will decrease, and we've seen some issues related to that we'll talk about further. But developing countries obviously have a higher replacement level fertility because their infant mortality is much higher, and so there's even fewer of them that reach reproductive age. So another thing we look at is total fertility rate, and that's the average number of children a woman typically has during those reproductive years, as I mentioned earlier. And again, there's a difference in developed versus developing countries. So developed countries, the total fertility rate is about 1.6, and in developing countries is about 2.9. And that should make sense with the stuff that we've talked about and we've seen. Developing countries, the women tend to have more children because, again, not all of them are going to survive. So that's a factor as well. On the previous slide, you may have noticed that the U.S. fertility rate, the U.S. birth rates have fluctuated over time. We had the baby boom after World War II, and then we had a baby bust that followed the baby boom. We've had a kind of a rebound baby boom after that. But we've really kind of leveled off, and in fact, our fertility rate has dropped below replacement level in the U.S. But because of immigration, which we'll talk about in a little bit, our population does still increase. So what are some factors that affect birth rates? Obviously, the cost of raising and educating children is a factor. It determines whether or not some families have more than one child. The availability of pensions, as we'll talk about a little bit later, the older people are supported by the younger people. So, you have to think in terms of, will there be enough money to support me when I retire? Urbanization, educational and employment opportunities for women, that is the #1 factor that affects birth rates. Women who are educated and who work outside of the home tend to have fewer children. So that is the #1 factor for reducing birth rate. Infant deaths obviously are going to affect that. The higher the infant mortality rate, the more children people will have to make up for that. The age at which people marry, the younger you are, the more children you're likely to have because you have more time in which to have them. The availability of contraceptives, the availability of abortions, these things all affect birth rates. And then conversely, things that affect death rates, the availability of food. If there's a lot of food available, that's going to lower the death rate. Good nutrition lowers the death rate. Advances in medicine, improved sanitation, safer water, all of these things are going to reduce the death rate. So again, as we talked about with populations in general, birth rate and death rate affect the size of the population. So if we lower the death rate, that also allows us to lower the birth rate because we don't need to have more children to make sure that some survive. So this graph here is looking at some of the things that have changed in the U.S. from the 1900s to the 2000s. So life expectancy has increased significantly, as you can see, 77 years now versus 47 years before. Much higher percent of women working outside the home, more education, homes with flushing toilets significantly more, electricity, more people living in suburbs, a higher wage adjusted for inflation, but also notice a lot more homicides per 100,000 people. So yes, there have been a lot of good things that have changed between the 1900s and the 2000s, but with that comes some negative things. But these, of course, have affected our birth rate. So that's part of why it's gone down, again, is the increased education and women working outside of the home. So as I said earlier, our birth rate in the U.S. has actually dropped below replacement level, but the reason why our population is still growing is because of immigration. Immigration has fluctuated over the years and continues to do so and will likely continue to do so. But as long as we allow immigration, and notice this is specifically looking at legal immigration, as long as we continue to allow immigration, our reduced fertility rates are not going to be a problem. But as we've seen with countries like Japan, if your fertility rate drops too low, then you don't have the working young people to support the retired old people. So immigration helps us with that. We're going to do a little activity later on that looks at age structure diagrams, but or these are also known as population pyramids. But basically, this looks at how many people are in each age group. Usually they're about 4-year age groups, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and so on. And what we find is that the bigger the base of the pyramid, the more rapidly the population is growing. So the pyramid on the far left has the highest population growth because it's got that big base. And the reason why that means high population growth is that big base, those guys are going to become reproductive age at some point, and they're going to also have lots of children, and that's just going to keep the population growing. As the base starts to move inward, population growth slows. When it's more straight up and down, then it's stable or zero population growth. And if the top is wider than the bottom, you have a declining population. And as I've said previously, that can be a problem in terms of having enough working people to support the elderly. So you don't necessarily want to end up with that too small of a base. You really want to aim for the straight up and down, that stable population. So population pyramids look at not only how many people are in each age group, but also compares males and females. And that can be important because of populations that do any kind of sex selection or just any differences in a significant difference in the number of males versus females. That can lead to other issues that we'll talk about more in our little population pyramid activity. All right, so I mentioned this earlier. Countries move from being developing to being developed or industrialized. And as they do that, they go through this demographic transition. And this is a path that is pretty consistent from country to country, regardless of where they are or who they are or the people that live there. They all seem to go through these stages. And so there's 4 stages. The pre-industrial stage, or stage 1, has very little population growth because there's a very high birth rate, but also a very high death rate. So you're not adding a lot of people to your population. But as industrialization begins and you move into the transitional stage, or stage 2, the birth rate remains high, but the death rate drops because of improved sanitation, food, improved medicine, things like that. So the death rate drops, but the birth rate stays high, and the population increases dramatically. So the transitional stage is critical, and the faster you can move through that transitional stage, the better, because if you stay in that stage for a long time, your population growth is going to get out of control. So then you move into the industrial stage, or the 3rd stage, and that's where you've got much slower population growth because the birth rate starts to decline as people start to use birth control and limit the number of children that they have. So it's still a little bit above the death rate, so they're still growing, but a lot slower than during that transitional stage. So then you have stage 4, the post-industrial stage, where you reach that zero population growth point where the birth rate and death rate are equal. And then you might move into what some people separate as a separate 5th stage, where the birth rate drops below the death rate and your population starts to decline. So again, sometimes that's considered a separate stage from this 4th stage. It just depends on the source that you look at, but some group it together as this one does. So in order to reduce population growth, the best thing to do is elevate the status of women. As I've already talked about, women in the workforce, women being educated, those are the #1 key factors for slowing population growth. And that's the goal. We want our population growth to slow so that we can have a sustainable planet. So we need to, as a global community, we need to help countries become developed and implement population policies. We need to provide access to family planning, reduce poverty, provide better health care for infants, children, pregnant women, nursing mothers, provide education specifically for girls and women, and improve the status of women, and increased involvement of men in the child rearing responsibilities and family planning. We've seen with India that that's a big issue because women are not seen as anything more than a commodity or a property, and so they're expected to handle all of the family rearing responsibilities, and they're not educated in the poorer communities. And that leads to more children and all sorts of health issues and things like that. So those are the goals. We want to reduce human population growth so that we have enough resources for everybody and we don't obviously destroy our planet.